He boarded the flight alone, tall, poised, and sharply dressed in a way that commanded presence without a word. Yet from the moment he stepped into the terminal, suspicion followed him like a shadow. His skin was dark, his posture calm, but to some, that was enough to question his place. What began as a routine trip spiraled into a storm of humiliation, silent cruelty, and cold authority, all cloaked beneath smiles and policy. What no one on that plane realized, not the crew, not the smirking passengers, not even those watching from their phone screens, was that they weren't mocking a man out of place. They were mocking the very person who had built the place they thought he didn't belong in. If you're ready for a story that turns power on its head and exposes truth in the most unexpected way, hit like, subscribe for more, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what would you have done if you saw it unfold? Theron Graves adjusted the cuffs of his tailored blazer as he walked through the crowded terminal of Monaghan International, his boarding pass held firmly between two fingers. Seat 2A, first class. He glanced once at the gate sign, Jetway Flight 2387, then made his way toward the priority boarding lane. He'd flown countless times before, always quiet, always courteous. But there was something about this morning, something in the static energy of the air that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. As he approached the boarding podium, he nodded politely to the attendant on duty, a slender woman in a sharp navy uniform. Her name tag read Marla Chetwin. Marla didn't greet him back. Her eyes moved quickly from his face to his boarding pass, then back to his face. The scanner beeped green. Confirmed. Still, she didn't move. "Sir," she said, tone-clipped, "can I see your ID again?" Theron blinked. He glanced down at the scanner, then at her. "Of course," he said calmly, reaching into his wallet and handing it to her. Marla took the ID with a touch of hesitation, scrutinizing it far longer than necessary. Behind Theron, the boarding line began to form. A couple in matching hoodies chatted quietly behind him, casting the occasional glance. The scanner had already verified everything, but Marla continued to inspect the ID like she was solving a crime scene. "This is a first-class boarding pass," she said finally, not accusing, but not far from it. "Are you sure this is yours?" Theron's mouth twitched slightly. "Yes, I'm quite sure." A man a few spots back in line muttered, "Some people always try to sneak in where they don't belong." Theron ignored it. Marla's eyes narrowed subtly. Then she turned and walked over to a second attendant, whispering something. The two shared a quick look in Theron's direction, then returned to their screens. Another passenger passed by without issue. Then another. A woman holding a latte and a toddler was waved through with a smile and a welcome aboard. Theron was still standing off to the side. A few more passengers boarded as Marla finally returned. "Okay," she said, her voice flat, "everything checks out. You may board." No apology, no explanation, just a casual assumption of inconvenience. Theron said nothing. He nodded once and stepped through the gate, rolling his carry-on behind him. Inside the jet bridge, he felt every footstep like a thunderclap in his chest. It was 2025. He'd worked too hard, built too much, sacrificed too often to be treated like a trespasser in a place he'd paid to enter. At the aircraft door, another attendant, male and younger, barely glanced at him before asking, "First class? Are you sure?" There was no irony, just a tone of doubt. Theron raised his boarding pass without a word. The man scanned it, hesitated, then stepped aside. "Okay, sir. Right this way." He entered the first-class cabin, spacious, serene, the hush of polished wealth. Seat 2A was empty, awaiting him. As he slid his bag into the overhead compartment, he felt eyes on him. A woman across the aisle gave him a quick glance, then pulled her handbag tighter against her lap. A businessman in 1B lowered his newspaper just enough to offer a slow once-over before retreating behind the headlines. Theron sat, smoothed the crease of his pants, and opened a leather-bound planner. He didn't want water or wine or champagne. He wanted dignity. A moment later, Marla came down the aisle, this time holding a tablet. "Sir," she said, stopping beside him, "can I see your boarding pass again?" Theron looked up, his face unreadable. "You already scanned it twice," he said. "I know, but we're having a seating conflict. Just to reconfirm." He handed her the pass. She glanced at it, tapped something on her tablet, then handed it back. No smile. No thank you. She moved on. The message was clear. They were waiting for him to prove he didn't belong. Behind her, a man in a baseball cap whispered to his neighbor, "Must be some kind of mistake." The neighbor nodded. No way he paid for that seat. Theron stared ahead, eyes on the seatback screen, seeing nothing. The flight filled slowly. Other first-class passengers were offered warm towels and drinks. He was not. When a flight attendant reached his row, she skipped him entirely. No greeting, no acknowledgement, just air. The man beside him chuckled. "Guess the computer didn't recognize your royalty status. Huh?" Theron turned slowly, looked him in the eye, then looked away without speaking. He didn't want a confrontation. He wanted a flight. But the shame was a rising tide, insidious, creeping. Every glance, every whisper, every pause too long to be innocent chipped away at him. "Mr. Graves," she said sharply, "I'm going to need you to move to another seat." Theron looked up slowly, trying to mask the confusion rising in his chest. "Excuse me," he asked calmly, though the tension in his throat made the words come out tighter than intended. Marla didn't flinch. "There's been reassignment. Seat 2A has been updated in the system for another passenger. I'll need you to relocate to 11C. Theron blinked. 11C, he repeated. "That's economy." Marla gave a polite, rehearsed smile. "Yes, sir. Due to a last-minute upgrade request by a high-priority flyer, your seat was reassigned by the system." Theron's voice dropped an octave, still composed but firm. "I booked 2A 3 weeks ago. Paid full fare. Business elite status. There's no way a computer just bumped me for a last-minute upgrade." As if on cue, a well-dressed man in his 50s with slick back hair and a smug grin stepped up to their row. He wore a gold-tie pin and an aura of entitlement. "Looks like I got lucky today," he said, throwing a pointed glance at Theron. "Thanks for warming my seat, pal." Theron turned toward him slowly. "This is my seat," he said. "Not anymore," the man replied with a chuckle, before tossing his duffel into the overhead bin and lowering himself into the seat Theron had just vacated. Marla cleared her throat. "Sir, we're on a tight schedule. I need you to move or I'll have to notify the captain." Her tone had changed. It was no longer polite. It was commanding, verging on hostile. Other passengers in the cabin began to watch. Heads turned. Murmurs started. Theron could feel their eyes on him. The subtle shifts in posture, the whispering judgment. A woman 3 rows up tapped her husband and whispered something behind her hand. A man with a laptop leaned back, clearly listening. Theron stood his ground. "I'd like to speak to the gate supervisor." Marla crossed her arms. "You can file a complaint after the flight, sir. Right now, you are not in your assigned seat." Her voice rose slightly on the last few words, ensuring everyone within 3 rows heard her. "Please stop trying to take someone else's seat." The words hit Theron like a slap. He heard them echo through the cabin, trying to take, and he saw how they settled into the minds of the watching crowd. That was the framing now, that he was the one intruding, that he was the problem. Theron took a deep breath, reminding himself that anger would be weaponized against him. He looked at the man now reclining in his seat, who offered nothing but a smirk and a shrug. "Come on, buddy. I'm sure Coach is fine," he said, then turned away to power up his tablet. Marla stepped closer. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to delay the flight, and that will affect all our passengers." The unspoken threat lingered between them. Delay the flight, be escorted off, become the problem they expect. Theron looked past her, past the judgment, past the smirks, and saw only a long road of battles like this one. He nodded slowly, picked up his bag from beneath the seat, and stepped back into the aisle. The silence was deafening. Not a single person spoke up. No one asked questions. No one defended him. As he moved down the aisle, someone from row 4 whispered, knew something was off. Theron didn't turn. He didn't acknowledge it. He just kept walking, each step a quiet surrender. He stared at the seat number printed above his head, the reality sharp and bitter. He didn't belong in this seat. He had paid for a premium experience, booked his ticket well in advance. And yet here he was, surrounded by the sounds of plastic wrappers and elbow fights for space, reduced from dignity to discomfort. 20 minutes into the flight, the turbulence of injustice hadn't settled. He unzipped his carry-on, pulled out his phone, and tapped open the JetWave app. The receipt was right there, confirmation of first-class booking, check-in timestamp, digital boarding pass, all irrefutable. He flagged down the passing attendant. "Excuse me," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I need to speak with your supervisor." The attendant, a young man with a buzz cut and a rigid posture, raised an eyebrow. "May I ask why?" "My seat in first class was taken without explanation. I was assigned to A, and I was moved here. I have confirmation and check-in proof. I'd like to resolve this." The attendant offered a stiff nod. "I'll get Kent." Minutes later, a man in his late 40s, stocky with a square jaw and a name tag reading Kent Mardell onboard supervisor, made his way down the aisle. He didn't smile. He didn't greet. He crouched beside Theron's row, glancing at him like one might regard a logistical hiccup. "Sir," he said, low and professional, "what seems to be the issue?" Theron held up the phone. "I booked 2A. I checked in early. I was told the seat was reassigned due to a system change, but that doesn't make sense. This is the receipt. Time-stamped. Paid. Confirmed." Kent looked at the screen briefly, then back at Theron. "Yes, I see. Unfortunately, our algorithm occasionally reprioritizes based on loyalty tier, frequent flyer status, and emergency reassignments." "So you downgraded me because I didn't fit some invisible tier?" Theron asked, voice flat. Kent shook his head. "It's not about that, sir. Sometimes our system glitches. It isn't personal." "It feels personal," Theron replied, eyes steady. "I was publicly accused of seat theft, and now I'm stuck in economy while someone else enjoys my seat." Kent stood up slowly. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I'll make a note and file an incident report. You can follow up with customer care post-flight." "That's it?" Theron asked. "No correction? No accountability for what your crew did?" Kent straightened his tie. "I assure you we'll look into it." Then, as if it explained everything, he added, "Marla's been with JetWave for 17 years. She knows our policy." Before Theron could respond, Kent walked away, already shifting attention to the next row with a broken seatback. Theron stared ahead, breathing through the throb in his temples. That was the shield. Corporate words wrapped in neutral tone. Nothing would change. No one would be held responsible. He was a line in a report, nothing more. A few rows up, a crew member leaned over to whisper to a fellow attendant. They both looked back at Theron briefly. One of them snorted. "Guess he doesn't look like a first-class kind of guy," he muttered, just loud enough to carry. Theron heard it. The burn of shame spread across his chest like wildfire. He looked down at his hands. They were steady, but inside him something quaked, an old, familiar ache. It wasn't the seat. It wasn't the app or the airline policy or the empty apologies. It was the idea that no matter how accomplished he was, no matter how much he earned or how hard he worked, there would always be people ready to strip his worth down to what they believed he looked like. The laugh behind the insult was more painful than the seat itself. It told him exactly what he already knew. The problem wasn't the glitch. The problem was the people who hid behind it. He didn't respond. As the flight settled into a quiet rhythm, the beverage cart rattled down the aisle and murmurs of small talk resumed. But Theron couldn't ignore the weight sitting on his chest. He glanced at his phone again, at the time-stamped booking confirmation for 2A, as if by staring at it long enough, the injustice might somehow correct itself. It didn't. It remained unchanged, a receipt of betrayal disguised as policy. 2 rows ahead, in 9D, his assistant Janae Fulton sat quietly beside an elderly woman who had been kind enough to shift seats, so they could at least sit near each other. Janae, dressed in professional gray slacks and a fitted blazer, carried herself with the same quiet dignity that Theron admired. She hadn't said much since boarding, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. She felt it too, the scrutiny, the coldness, the stares. Suddenly, a flight attendant, tall, pale, and young, approached their row and paused beside Janae. His voice was soft. but his words pierced like glass. "Ma'am, I need you to step into the galley for a quick bag check. Routine procedure." Janae looked up, confused. "I'm sorry," she asked. "What kind of check?" "Just a standard inspection," he replied, already reaching toward the overhead bin. "It's random. We do them occasionally mid-flight for safety." Theron immediately sat up, turning in his seat to face the aisle. "Excuse me," he said firmly. "Is there a reason my colleague was singled out?" The attendant stiffened, but didn't look directly at him. "It's random, sir. Standard protocol." Janae stood reluctantly, eyes scanning the cabin, aware of the growing attention. The elderly woman beside her frowned and shifted uncomfortably. "I haven't seen anyone else get checked," Janae said, keeping her voice low. "Just you," the attendant replied. His smile was thin, polite on the surface, but rooted in something colder. "It'll only take a moment." As Janae was led toward the galley, Theron rose halfway out of his seat, only to be waved down by a second flight attendant who suddenly appeared, body language guarded. "Sir, please stay seated," he said quickly. FAA regulations require passengers to remain seated during in-flight procedures. Theron sat slowly, swallowing his rising anger. He watched as Janae was ushered to the back of the plane, her laptop bag in hand, her expression unreadable. Around them, passengers began whispering. A few turned their heads. One woman in 8F shook her head and whispered something to her partner. An older man across the aisle scoffed and muttered, probably forgot to check her bag at security. The implication, like everything else, was layered in condescension. Theron leaned back, his fists curled in his lap, helpless to intervene, without drawing more attention, more suspicion, more risk. A few minutes later, Janae returned, her posture stiff, her eyes hard. She didn't say a word as she sat back down, but Theron could see it, her dignity scraped raw. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He knew. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of recognition. A child across the aisle, no older than 7, turned to his father and asked innocently, "Why are the nice people being picked on?" The boy's father looked away, avoiding the question, but the words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to unhear. A ripple of discomfort passed through the cabin. A woman to the left glanced at Theron, guilt flickering across her features. A young man nearby shifted in his seat, eyes cast downward. No one spoke. No one stood. But the truth had been spoken by the one voice too young to be conditioned into silence. She hadn't said a word since she returned, and that silence, more than anything, filled the space between them with a sharp, invisible tension. He could feel it under his skin, in the pulse of his temples, in the stiffness of his posture. Everything about this flight, every word, every action, was beginning to feel not like coincidence or procedure, but like something deliberate. With no more patience left, he tapped the call button above his seat. Moments later, a steward approached. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" Theron kept his tone composed but pointed. "I need to speak with someone from airport operations. Ground authority. This has gone too far." The steward blinked as if surprised by the request. "We're already airborne, sir. Any ground concerns can be reported after landing." "I'm aware we're in the air," Theron said tightly, "but I want the crew to log a formal request to contact gate authority immediately upon arrival. I also want a notation added to the flight manifest that I've formally protested a discriminatory reassignment and baseless in-flight search of my associate." The steward hesitated. "I'll notify the lead." A few minutes later, Kent Mardell, the onboard supervisor Theron had spoken to earlier, returned with a forced calm in his eyes. "Mr. Graves, I understand you have concerns, but I need to remind you that any escalation during a flight can be considered a disruption. I strongly advise you to direct all complaints to JetWave customer service after we land." "No," Theron replied. "This is not a customer service matter. This is a civil rights violation, Kent, and I want that recorded in your onboard logs now." Kent's expression hardened. "Sir, if you continue to challenge operational decisions mid-flight, I'll have no choice but to document this as non-compliance." "Document it however you want," Theron said, leaning forward slightly. But if you think I'm going to be bullied into silence, you've underestimated the wrong man." Ken took a step back and nodded. "Understood," he said coldly. "Then let me make something clear as well. If you do not remain seated and compliant, I will instruct the captain to contact authorities for an escort upon landing." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Theron seething. Janae leaned slightly toward him. "They want us to react," she said under her breath. "They want a scene. Don't give it to them." He nodded faintly, the pressure in his chest building to a silent crescendo. Moments later, another attendant returned. "Sir, you've been reseated to 26F, she said abruptly. "This is due to an operational reassignment. Please move now." Theron looked at her, stunned. "I was already downgraded once. Now you're moving me farther back." The attendant said nothing else, just stood waiting. Passengers around them began turning their heads again. The tension in the cabin was suddenly sharp enough to cut. Theron stood slowly. "Fine," he said. "Let's move this circus to the back." He pulled his bag from beneath the seat and stepped into the aisle. As he moved down the narrow passage, the plane seemed to close in around him. Murmurs rose. Phones were lifted. Someone pointed. A teenage boy near row 19 grinned and whispered something to his friend, who immediately raised his phone and began recording. "Look at this," he whispered, zooming in. "Dude got kicked out of first and now coach." The boy tapped a quick caption into a video app before uploading it. "Fake CEO gets grounded." Theron didn't see the upload. He didn't hear the snickering laughter that followed. But he felt it, the way his steps sounded heavier, the way the air thickened as he moved past each row, the way eyes followed him like spectators at a public spectacle. They tried to erase his presence. No matter how much he earned, no matter how cleanly he dressed or how calm he spoke, they saw only what they chose to see. And when he dared speak up, dared challenge their system, they punished him with indifference and escalation. Theron glanced at the teenager a few rows ahead, still smirking at his phone. Somewhere in the digital void, a video of him was circulating, captioned with mockery, misunderstood by strangers who would never see the truth behind his silence. But what those passengers didn't know, what Marla and Kent and the rest of the Jetwave crew failed to realize, was that Theron Graves didn't simply fly first class. He owned it, literally. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Theron reached into his satchel, retrieved a slim black tablet the size of a paperback, and activated it with a fingerprint scan. The screen glowed softly. He tapped a secure app with a silver emblem, Aurelius Partners, the holding company, the one with controlling stakes in several corporations, including Jetwave Airlines. The interface was clean, minimal, and encrypted, a private terminal accessible only to select executives and high-level stakeholders. Theron typed a few words into the command bar, then hesitated for one final second. He wasn't angry, he was resolved. The time for requests and quiet protests had ended. He typed 3 simple words: "Initiate sequence." Then he pressed send. The screen blinked, then cleared. No confirmation, no pop-up. It didn't need one. In the boardrooms of power, silence was the loudest message of all. 10 rows away, the flight crew moved routinely through the aisle, unaware of the ripple that had just begun. At the corporate headquarters of Jetwave's parent firm, located in a glass tower in Manhattan, a senior board member's phone lit up with an encrypted alert. He paused mid-meeting, eyes narrowing at the code. Not a casual message, not a scheduled memo. This was a priority ping, executive clearance level 1. His fingers tapped rapidly across a screen. Within 60 seconds, he was on the line with the Vice President of Airline Operations. "We've got a situation on Flight 2387, he said quietly. "Graves has activated. Immediate damage control. Prepare response protocol." Back on the plane, Theron placed the tablet back in his bag and sat upright. He didn't look around. He didn't speak. But something inside him had shifted. The helplessness was gone. In its place sat a coiled certainty, calm but implacable. He hadn't needed to yell. He didn't need the crew to believe him. The machine they trusted so blindly was now turning under his command. And the irony? It would come silently, professionally, and with devastating efficiency. He glanced at Janae, who now sat a few rows up. She caught his eye, her expression still pained but curious. He nodded once, subtle, but she understood. Something was happening. Something they couldn't stop. In the cockpit, the pilot's comms blinked with a secure notification, a coded relay from operations. He frowned, adjusted his headset, and began a discreet call with the flight director. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, Kent Mardell walked past row 26 without acknowledging Theron. Marla Chetwynd stood near the galley, chatting with a colleague, her body language relaxed, unbothered. Theron watched her for a moment, not with anger, but with the quiet scrutiny of a man who no longer needed to speak to be heard. The wheel had begun to turn, and neither she nor Kent knew they were already under it. They had framed him as powerless, but now they would learn the truth in a way that no confrontation could teach. That wasn't how the upper echelons of corporate power operated. Instead, it would arrive through coded instructions, policy strings pulled from far above, and decisions that would cascade through ranks without explanation. In the cockpit, the pilot, Captain Everett Harlan, had just adjusted their altitude when a priority alert blinked onto his secondary screen. It wasn't from air traffic control. It was routed through the airline's executive relay system, only activated in situations involving direct oversight from Jetwave's parent company. Harlan keyed into the message and read the short command: direct intervention from Aurelius Holdings. Flight 2387 is under review. Follow compliance protocol. Internal oversight, dispatch confirmed. The captain leaned back slightly. He had flown for Jetwave for over 15 years and had seen priority alerts before, weather diversions, mechanical flags, but never anything tied directly to the holding company. That level of instruction bypassed even Jetwave's senior command. Without a word, he turned to his first officer. Contact lead supervisor. Tell him the company is initiating a compliance review in flight. Ask him to report to the flight deck. The co-pilot relayed the message quickly and efficiently. Moments later, Kent Mardell was standing in the cockpit entryway, confusion shadowing his face. "Sir," he asked, "what's the issue?" "Not an issue," the captain replied flatly. "We've received a protocol directive. It appears one of our passengers is initiating an internal complaint from inside the network. High level." Kent frowned. "From a passenger?" "From someone connected to Aurelius," Harlan clarified. "No details, but I'm instructed to comply with oversight requests and advise crew accordingly." Kent's throat went dry. There was only one person on this flight who had presented himself with unusual confidence, the one whose seat was reassigned, the one who had asked for documentation, who had challenged the system without ever raising his voice: Theron Graves. Kent didn't wait. He stepped out of the cockpit and moved quickly down the aisle toward the galley. Marla Chetwynd was chatting with a fellow flight attendant when he approached. "Marla," he said, "come with me." She gave him a puzzled look, but followed without question. They stepped into the curtained area behind first class, where Kent pulled out his device and opened a secure staff channel. He entered the flight's incident report, a digital log that included all passenger crew interactions. A red flag had already appeared next to Graves' name. "What's this?" Marla asked, scanning the screen. "Compliance alert," Kent muttered. "We're being reviewed mid-flight. Passenger in 26F has executive connections." "You're kidding," she said, lips curling into a half-laugh. "He's in the back row. He's also apparently tied to the board of Aurelius," Kent said. "And they just activated internal oversight. I have to notify you. You're being relieved of duty pending review." Marla stared at him, color draining from her face. "Relieved?" she repeated. "You can't be serious." "I followed protocol." "That's not my call anymore," Kent said, voice lower now. "They're pulling logs. They have the manifest, the boarding footage, everything. Your decisions are being evaluated." "For what?" "For enforcing seat assignments," she snapped. "For mistaking someone's booking status?" "For how you handled it," Kent replied. "I suggest you stay in the galley until we land. Don't interact further with passengers." Marla opened her mouth to argue, but Kent had already turned away. Her knees felt unsteady. This wasn't a reprimand, it was an execution. Quiet, swift, and corporate. She sat down heavily on the crew bench hands trembling slightly. Back in row 26F, Theron saw Kent walk past again, more hurried now. He glanced toward the galley and caught the faintest glimpse of Marla sitting with her head bowed, staring blankly ahead. She looked like a woman who'd just received news that shattered the narrative she'd built for herself. A narrative that said she was untouchable, that she was right, that she could treat people however she wanted so long as she framed it within policy. He had noticed a change in tone from the staff, the forced neutrality in their voices, the cautious distance they maintained whenever they passed him. Kent Mardell had made 3 silent trips between first class and the cockpit, his usual confident gait reduced to measured steps. Marla Chetwynd had not reappeared once. She remained behind the curtain, out of sight, subdued and uncertain. Theron hadn't moved from his seat, hadn't spoken a word since the call for descent, but inside, he felt the weight of clarity settle into place. He had chosen silence as his weapon, and now the system that dismissed him was being forced to reckon with his truth. As the wheels touched the tarmac with a smooth thud, a ripple of anticipation moved through the plane. Most passengers prepared for the usual routine, collect bags, stretch limbs, and hurry toward baggage claim. But for Theron, this landing marked a moment of deliberate arrival, not just physically but symbolically. The injustice endured mid-air was no longer contained within the metal walls of the aircraft. It was now a matter of corporate consequence. While the plane taxied, the cockpit received its final message from operations. Hold at gate. Executive protocol in effect. Ground response team authorized. The captain acknowledged the command and turned to his crew. Prepare for secure disembarkation. Flight protocol has been overridden. Kent, pale and silent, stood at the front of the plane, receiving instructions through his headset. He didn't meet anyone's eyes, especially not those of the man he had dismissed hours earlier. As the plane came to a full stop, the jet bridge locked into place, but the doors did not open immediately. Instead, a team of individuals in suits entered through the forward hatch. One was the airline's regional director, another from legal affairs. 2 others held identification tags from Aurelius Partners, the parent company. A uniformed officer stood at the door not as a threat, but as a formal measure of protocol. Passengers were asked to remain seated for a brief security debrief, a phrase that drew confused glances and curious murmurs. Then, in a voice clear and composed, the lead executive addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your cooperation. We ask for your patience as we complete an operational review related to today's flight. Certain individuals will be escorted for private conversation regarding conduct during travel. Your understanding is appreciated." The tension in the cabin rose like steam. Kent was approached first. One of the Aurelius representatives handed him a sealed folder. Kent opened it, eyes scanning the document. His face drained. "Is this?" he began. The representative nodded. "Effective immediately. You are suspended pending full review of your conduct aboard this flight. You will surrender your badge and be escorted to a private terminal." Kent looked stunned, too stunned to argue. As he was quietly led away, whispers erupted behind him. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening. Then came Marla, still in uniform, eyes wide. She was summoned from behind the curtain. When handed her letter, her hands trembled. "What is this?" she asked, voice cracking. "You can't just— This is not a debate," the representative said calmly. "You are no longer an acting crew member. The decision was made following a directive from the board." Marla's mouth fell open. "The board," she echoed. "But I don't understand who initiated this." No one answered. Not yet. Meanwhile, the aisle cleared, and 2 members of the legal team made their way to row 26F. They stopped beside Theron and addressed him with the respect that had been absent for the entire flight. "Mr. Graves," the lead said, "thank you for your patience. We've arranged a private transport to the terminal. Your assistant is being escorted as well. Please allow us to accompany you." Passengers now openly stared as Theron rose from his seat, calm and collected, as if this moment had always been part of the plan. He walked past the rows of faces, each bearing curiosity, confusion, or dawning realization. When he passed the business class row, one woman, who had clutched her purse at the start of the flight, now looked at him with wide, almost embarrassed eyes. No one spoke. No one mocked. Theron stepped through the aircraft doors and into a corridor of officials waiting to greet him. Among them stood a senior executive from Aurelius who extended a hand. "Mr. Graves, we appreciate your discretion. The board was notified and is fully briefed. Media inquiries have already begun. We'll manage the response according to your direction." "Let them know I won't speak until the internal review concludes," Theron replied. "This is about culture, not headlines." Behind them, Marla watched from inside the jetway, still gripping her letter. She turned to the nearest flight agent and whispered, "Who is he?" The agent looked at her, wide-eyed. "You don't know? That's Theron Graves. He's not just a passenger." Theron Graves, identified in news outlets within hours of landing, was revealed to be not only a legitimate first-class ticket holder, but also the chairman of Aurelius Partners, the holding company with controlling interest in Jetwave Airlines. What had been framed as an awkward seating error and a procedural misunderstanding unraveled into a corporate disaster. The initial press statement from Jetwave attempted to downplay the incident, referring to it as a regrettable in-flight service miscommunication. But by then, major outlets had already obtained official documents, sealed flight reports, internal memos, and testimonies from other passengers, some of whom came forward on record to share what they witnessed: the public interrogation, the forced relocation, the mockery, the unwarranted search of a black female professional, and the callous attitude of the crew toward a man they wrongly assumed held no power. Within 24 hours, Jetwave's stock plummeted by 7%. Investors panicked. A board meeting was convened under emergency conditions. The company's PR firm, usually able to spin even the worst turbulence into a customer service story, advised immediate damage control. On the third day after the flight, Jetwave issued a formal apology addressed directly to Theron Graves, published on all major media platforms, and pushed across social media with a solemn tone. "We deeply regret the unacceptable treatment experienced by Mr. Theron Graves and Ms. Janae Fulton aboard Flight 2387. We acknowledge that the behavior exhibited by members of our crew failed to reflect the values we aspire to uphold. An internal investigation is underway, and necessary actions are being taken to ensure accountability and reform." Marla Chetwin received a termination letter by certified courier. The official reasoning cited failure to follow protocol, unprofessional conduct, and violation of Jetwave's anti-discrimination policy. She didn't speak to reporters. Her neighbors saw her pacing her apartment balcony at dusk, phone pressed to her ear, her face pale and clenched. She refused to give interviews, but a leaked message from her to a former co-worker hinted at disbelief and fury. "They made an example out of me," she had written. "One mistake and I'm gone. No one cared when I was employee of the quarter 6 times in 5 years. But others did care. Other former passengers. Other names." As the story of Theron Graves spread, so did stories of passengers who remembered similar incidents: quiet downgrades, unverified ID checks, bags randomly inspected, all under the careful guise of policy. Some posted receipts. Others shared screenshots. A class action lawsuit began to form in the background, spearheaded by a civil rights attorney who had previously represented clients in major transportation discrimination cases. Kent Mardell, meanwhile, was placed on indefinite administrative leave pending the outcome of the internal review. His badge access was revoked. He was asked not to speak publicly, but a news crew spotted him outside a coffee shop 2 blocks from Jetwave's headquarters, looking thinner, tired, and visibly shaken. When approached, he offered no comment. He knew why. The company he had defended so confidently during the flight was now distancing itself from him with calculated silence. Internal documents from Aurelius, leaked through unnamed sources, confirmed that compliance policies for Jetwave and its subsidiaries were being overhauled under Theron Graves' direction. A task force was assembled to review employee training modules, focusing on unconscious bias, escalation protocols, and customer dignity. The term gate-level profiling became a new industry phrase, pulled from a section of Theron's personal report to the board. It described the pattern of treating certain passengers with skepticism from the first moment of contact, an experience he had articulated with chilling precision. Public opinion turned swiftly. Once the news hit mainstream media, public support for Theron surged. He didn't give interviews. He didn't attend talk shows or morning programs. But the image of him composed in that final row, being approached by executives on the tarmac, became a symbol of silent resistance, turning into undeniable authority. JetWave CEO issued a personal letter to Aurelius, acknowledging that change was overdue. We must rebuild trust not only with Mr. Graves, but with every passenger who has ever felt unseen in our cabins. Internally, employees were put on notice. Management teams were reshuffled. Leadership diversity was questioned. And for the first time in years, customer feedback channels were flooded not with complaints about food or seat space, but with questions about ethics, accountability, and respect. Weeks after the scandal surrounding Flight 2387 had settled into its new place in the archives of corporate embarrassment, change began to take root in places no one had anticipated. The headlines had quieted, the investors had stopped panicking, and JetWave's operations began to stabilize under the shadow of Aurelius' newly implemented oversight. But for two individuals at the heart of the storm, the repercussions were far from over. Marla Chetwin, once a celebrated flight attendant with a record for punctuality and exemplary service, found herself in the unfamiliar position of being unemployed, publicly disgraced, and facing civil proceedings tied to a class action lawsuit. The separation from JetWave had been swift, but the court's ruling required more than a pink slip. She was ordered to attend an intensive, months-long sensitivity and ethics training program, one commonly used for law enforcement and public service officials who had exhibited patterns of racial bias. At first, she arrived defiant. She sat in the back of the room, arms crossed, and gave curt, dismissive responses to the facilitator's questions. But something changed after the third session. It was during a video module where the participants were asked to watch a series of real testimonies from victims of systemic bias. One particular recording featured a woman describing how her child was singled out in school, labeled aggressive for behavior that went unchallenged in others. The woman's voice cracked with restrained grief as she described how even the act of defending herself became ammunition used against her. Marla sat still, eyes fixed on the screen, her fingers clenching the edge of her seat. She heard the same tone, the same tired restraint she had heard in Theron Graves' voice that day on the plane. It wasn't until week 5 that the dam broke. During a group exercise on accountability, Marla was asked to reenact her own encounter with Theron from a flight. As she repeated the words she had spoken, "Are you sure this is your seat?" and "Stop trying to take someone else's seat," her voice cracked. She paused mid-sentence, then lowered her face into her hands. The room was silent. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red. "I didn't see him," she whispered. "I didn't see the man. I just saw a problem. Something I didn't trust." The facilitator nodded, but said nothing. The room didn't judge her. It didn't forgive her either. It simply witnessed her realization. Meanwhile, Kent Mardell, who had been placed on unpaid leave, received an invitation through his union to attend a community forum on racial bias in public transportation. It wasn't mandatory, but the letter made it clear that participation would be noted during the company's internal review of his future with JetWave. Kent went reluctantly. He wore a plain jacket, kept his head low, and didn't introduce himself to anyone. The forum was held in a community center on the south side of Seattle, far from the clean glass offices he once called home. The attendees were not executives or HR specialists. They were ordinary people, school teachers, bus drivers, a mother who worked the late shift at a grocery store. They spoke of times they were overlooked, challenged, or outright harassed while simply trying to move through the world. Kent listened. He didn't speak during the first session, nor the second, but he returned, quietly, every week. By the fourth week, he signed up to volunteer with a local youth mentorship program, working anonymously behind the scenes to help students prepare for college interviews and career planning. He didn't wear his JetWave badge. He didn't talk about the flight. He just listened, helped, and stayed. In the meantime, JetWave under Theron Graves' influence implemented sweeping reforms. Every employee, from the front desk agents to the pilots, underwent new training not just in customer service, but in cultural humility. They replaced outdated bias modules with interactive workshops led by community leaders and civil rights advocates. The company created a Passenger Dignity Council, chaired by Graves himself, ensuring that future policy would be shaped not by statistics and algorithms, but by lived experience. But Theron, for all his power, kept a low profile. He declined televised interviews, refused op-ed columns, and turned down every panel invitation. When asked by shareholders during the next annual meeting how he intended to frame the company's future, he responded simply, with eyes open. The most powerful transformation, however, happened quietly, without cameras or applause. One evening, during a closed session of the training program, Marla stayed behind. She waited until the last person had left before approaching the facilitator. "Do you think," she asked, voice hesitant, "people like him ever forgive?" The facilitator looked at her for a long moment, then replied, "Forgiveness is an ode, but change earns a chance to try." Somewhere across the city, Kent helped a teenage girl prepare for a scholarship interview. He adjusted her tie, gave her advice on posture, and when she thanked him, he just smiled and said, "Just make them see you." And in his quiet apartment, Theron sat with Janae, reviewing the first wave of reports from the Dignity Council. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need validation. He had built something stronger than outrage. He had built a system that remembered. A system that would not forget who deserved to be seen. The end. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more gripping narratives like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps bring these stories to life. What did you think of the plot? Did the twist surprise you? Were you satisfied with how the characters changed by the end? Let us know in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.